thank you for joining. This is my presentation on the strategy in the autonomous vehicle sector. Just a very quick heads up, I will use the term autonomous vehicle and AV and self-driving car interchangeably. They're all more or less the same thing for the purpose of this. The other thing I'd like to point out while you read the slide is the overwhelming majority of the research I did was pre-COVID-19. I could do a whole other report just based on what's going to happen post-COVID-19. I think changes that were once thought really unlikely or even impossible are actually going to happen. I think some very large investments are going to be written off, and I think some companies, if they are able to survive, are going to look extremely different than the way that they do now. So what I wanted to focus on for my research topic and my paper in this presentation was when we think about autonomous cars or self-driving cars, the way they go to market as mainstream technologies tends to take two kind of forms. On one hand, you have Tesla, who are building cars themselves. Those cars are sold to consumers, and those consumer cars drive themselves, more or less. We'll get into that. And then on the opposite side, what we haven't really seen commercialized yet, at least at scale, is the kind of thing that Waymo and Uber are doing, which is building a more or less purpose-built self-driving, what I call a Robotaxi, or what the industry calls a Robotaxi, which consumers cannot buy. They are either sold to ride-sharing companies or to the auto manufacturers themselves, and they are literally trying to build out a massive network of robotic taxis that drive themselves. So just a very quick note, most of the levels of automation that we hear about today in autonomous vehicles are not really there yet. Depending on how you interpret whether or not the driver needs to have their hands on the wheel, most of the cars that we're seeing are kind of level 3 or 4 today. Nobody has level 5, despite Tesla maybe problematically calling their system autopilot. It is definitely not level 5. So even if the business strategies were to shake out tomorrow, the technology still has a way to go. Cars can drive themselves today, sure, but only in good conditions. There's no car today that could drive in a snowstorm in the middle of the night, with no streetlights or maps. That does not exist, and that will probably be a long time, maybe a decade or more before that becomes the mainstream. So I'll just touch quickly on the 4 parts of the tech stack that is required for an autonomous car. As you can imagine, this is fairly straightforward. The car needs a vision system to see where it's going. The car needs a processing system to interpret the outside world and then turn that into navigation in the navigation system, so it figures out where it is in the world and where it needs to go. And then finally, the car needs some kind of driving interface where you can actually control where the car is going and how. So to press the brake pedal or gas pedal if it has one, and then turn the steering if it has a steering wheel. I will say that in the US and other developed countries, self-driving or autonomous vehicles are synonymous with electric vehicles. We can maybe talk about this in the questions segment, but I don't really expect that to hold in the developing world where traffic problems are huge and electricity grids are pretty fragile. I think we'll actually see gasoline-powered autonomous vehicles. This slide is actually from 2017, so you can imagine that this has changed significantly in the 3 years since I found it, but this is just a really quick overview of just how many players there are in the market, the majority of which we've never heard of, but also where some of them are actually playing. So you can see some companies like Zipcar, which is not a manufacturer you think of or a company that you think of as really being part of the autonomous landscape. But if they are hoping to survive, they will have to come up with some kind of a way to stay relevant. And somebody like them will almost certainly have to partner with somebody. So in this presentation, I kind of broke it out in a couple of big buckets. So we have what I would call the legacy manufacturers, so like your Ford, GM, Fiat Chrysler, and Toyota. And they are doing a fairly traditional route to market where they are partnering with an existing company. In this case, GM is using Cruise. Toyota is also using Cruise. And at the core, GM is a mass market manufacturer. They made almost 3 million cars and trucks worldwide last year. So they're a huge assembler of cars. And they sell virtually every vehicle segment, so small, medium, large, and trucks in virtually every global market. They are basically everything to everybody. The problem with this is they are not really sure what they want to be. They have not decided if they want to pivot to being a full Robotaxi company. Their Cruise subsidiary is now making Robotaxis for a Robotaxi network. So you will probably not be able to buy a Cruise branded vehicle as a consumer to have it drive you around. You would have to buy something like the current generation Cadillac, which actually has something called Super Cruise, which in my opinion is the best autonomous vehicle stack out there. It's better than Tesla's Autopilot. It is more limited, but it does what it does better, whereas Tesla is probably a little bit too liberal with the level that it operates at. The big strength for GM is it is an incredibly good manufacturer of vehicles. Your average car has got about 30,000 individual parts. GM makes a lot of them and makes them well, and it makes them basically everywhere. The problem is, as I mentioned, their focus is everywhere, which, as our strategy professors say, then your focus is nowhere. So it needs to decide what it wants to be in order to kind of play in the market. The next one we think of, which I won't spend as much time on because everybody knows it, is Tesla. It makes a fraction of the cars that GM makes, but it does it without a partnership. All the design and development is in-house, and the distribution is run by the company itself. Virtually everything that Tesla does, once assembly has started, it does in-house. It doesn't really partner with anybody other than your kind of typical OEM suppliers. It has a huge head start in actually getting autonomous vehicle technology in cars, and it has a great mind share, but it doesn't really sell that many vehicles. The strengths and weaknesses for this country, for the company, one of which is Elon Musk. He is a magnificently charismatic CEO who has had a series of some pretty big missteps. Other than that, the company's very well vertically integrated. The supercharger network is very convenient to repurpose if you have a Robotaxi network, because now you've got somewhere where your cars can all go and recharge themselves. The big risk is they are still a fairly small company. They have a massive market cap that doesn't really reflect the real financials underpinning the company. They don't make that many vehicles. The vehicles they do make money on, some of them they don't. Some vehicles they do sell, not all of which they make money on. And the financial foundation of the company is a kind of perennial concern. So looking at a kind of different way that a company has decided to go into the market is Waymo. So it's part of Google's holding company, Alphabet. Waymo is, in a sense, not really sure what it's trying to do. They have a very small fleet of robotaxis that you can actually use, but they're only in a couple of target markets, and they don't seem to have big plans to roll out testing. They seem to be much more focused on getting the product as perfect as possible, and then I think they'll try and figure out how they want to do a rollout. They have an incredibly good stack, but whether or not that translates into the actual car experience itself is something that remains to be seen. Probably their biggest strength is being under the Alphabet umbrella. They have phenomenal human capital. They've got basically unlimited financial capital. And unlike Uber, they don't have to make any money in order to survive as a going concern. Alphabet is perfectly willing to underwrite them for as long as it takes. The big risk is, I think, they still don't have a clear strategy. They probably want to be a robotaxi company, but they might decide to just build a really good stack and license it out to somebody else. They might decide to build a really good set of hardware chassis and market those out to somebody else. It's going to be really interesting to see what they do in the long term, but fortunately for them, they can actually survive into the long term with basically no real financial concerns. And then another different approach that is maybe the most volatile of all of them is what Uber is doing. So Uber's push is to become a robo-taxi company that is kind of piggybacking on the ride sharing company that they are today. So when Uber started, obviously they just had, tens and tens of millions of drivers out there. They've got almost 5 billion rides in the book. So they've got a ton of data on where people want to go, how much they want to pay, how long it takes them to get there, what the traffic is like in all these different markets. And it kind of makes, in a sense, a really good business sense to pivot into being a robo-taxi company, because you're going to open the same app. You've already got the same reputational trust with consumers, but instead of hailing a human-driven taxi, you're going to hire a computer-driven robo-taxi. The problem with this approach is you're really banking on customer loyalty to the Uber platform. And when you start to think about, whether Google could build this platform out itself, Google is obviously pretty good with big data sets as well. And what makes any of us think that Google could do, or that Uber could do a better job than Google and actually hold on to the platform better than somebody like Google could? So their long-term strategy is pretty challenging, because they have to find a way to become more or less a robo-taxi company while also maintaining enough profitability to get there. Interestingly enough, they have partnered with a big manufacturer to develop their own AVs, but somewhat unusually, it's Volvo. So Volvo is a Swedish company that's actually owned by a Chinese holding company, and they're a pretty small manufacturer globally. Obviously, they're bigger than Tesla, but they are not, one of the big three American companies, or one of the big Japanese companies, or even one of the big Italian companies. Volvo is really a pretty niche market. Probably the biggest reason behind Uber going with Volvo is Volvo's own autonomous stack is actually pretty good. What was very surprising when it came to light was the fact that when Uber had a fatal accident in New Mexico, in Arizona, the Volvo self-driving stack was mostly disabled, and Uber was actually using most of its own technology in the car. The biggest risk, I think, for Uber is really twofold. Is one, before COVID, can they survive long enough as a going concern in order to make this pivot possible? And then the second risk is they are trying to be a lot of things to a lot of people. They're thinking about trucking. They're thinking about kind of, short haul, less than truckload freight. Can they actually do all this stuff while still retaining relevance as a robo-taxi market or as a ride sharing company? And for example, can they do it better than their rival Lyft, which is developing their own self-driving cars? And then can they do it better than somebody like Google, who is obviously under the Alphabet umbrella with Waymo, trying to do that better than they can? Even freight, you have Otto, who is a huge competitor for Uber Freight. So they have a very difficult kind of strategy from all aspects. They are under attack virtually everywhere that they play. And so in terms of thinking of what the future looks like, again, all of this, or almost all of this research was done before COVID. We needed to have market consolidation before COVID. So if you remember the slide from 2017 with all those different players, we've got 3 years more of those guys in there. And they are going to have to figure out who is viable and who isn't. Probably the biggest two takeaways from this are the middle two bullets. The manufacturers like Ford and GM need to figure out whether or not they want to make autonomous vehicles for us consumers, or whether they want to build out robo-taxis at scale. I'm a little less worried about Tesla, because Tesla is kind of fundamentally a niche manufacturer, and Tesla could probably survive building, high performance luxury autonomous cars for people without significantly changing their financial future or their strategy. Whereas Ford or GM are going to need to decide, which market do we spend all of our money in. The second one, the third bullet, which is the second point I wanted to make, is when you think about companies like Waymo and to a lesser extent Cruise, and certainly Uber, Building a really large network of really expensive, really complicated pieces of equipment is a lot harder than writing software. And I think software companies are in for a pretty rude shock once they, or if they decide to start rolling out tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of robotaxis. Despite what perceptions we have in terms of the quality of current auto manufacturers, particularly in this country, automakers themselves are incredibly good at the business of actually assembling cars at scale for small profit margins for dozens of markets around the world. It is a very difficult problem that they face, but they do it very well. Certainly some of the strategic discipline is not always evident when we look at particularly the big three in the US, but fundamentally they are very, very good at making cars, and making cars is an exceptionally difficult thing to do. Tesla has been around in various incarnations for almost 2 decades. They make about 360,000 cars a year. Ford makes just under 3 million cars. Sorry, GM makes just under 3 million cars a year, and Toyota makes a little bit over 11 million cars. So trying to scale this stuff up is a monumental challenge. And I think it's often underestimated, particularly by Tesla, but by other companies as well. What I think the real viable middle ground looks like long-term for autonomous vehicles is really manufacturers figuring out how can we come up with a standardized, probably modularized chassis. So kind of like a skateboard. So it's got the wheels, the chassis that the wheels bolt onto, it's got the battery pack, and it's got the motors at each end. And then there's the software to drive that. I think if companies can figure out how to make that at scale, then they can kind of offload those units to robotaxi companies to customize, or other auto manufacturers to customize into either consumer AVs or robotaxis as well. Because that to me seems like a much more viable middle ground, where you're basically turning your company into a very sophisticated supplier of very expensive, complicated technology, as opposed to the all or nothing approach of we either make cars or we make one type of component. I think the real road ahead is to be a middle ground there. That way the robotaxi market, if it takes off, can actually be pursued by the big manufacturers. And if it doesn't, then they can kind of trade those in for just making really good consumer self-driven cars. And that's all that I had. So if anybody has any questions, let me see if I can bring up the chat, or you guys can just
thank you, Chris.
raise your hands and ask away.
All right, we've got a few hands raised. We'll go ahead and start with Patrick, please. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, thanks for kind of recapping that. My question is, when you think ahead, right, if projecting forward as the technology and the capabilities become more reliable, and you think about that value chain, whether it's the manufacturing of cars, the technology, whether that's hardware, software, the interface with customers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's, when I've talked to folks about this, they feel like, given the way that our roads are, and our traffic and our ability to drive is regulated centrally via government agencies, that there's going to have to be some convergence, right, of this, whether that's open sourcing the ultimate code or whatever it is, right? So that, and we generally don't like one winner, which tech loves, but generally when it comes to auto and other places, we don't like one winner. Given all that, and you think about the value chain, how do you see those winners? When you think about, Uber, whether it's, what I've heard a lot of is licensing their platform out, others kind of thinking through that, does that reshuffle how you think about this, given that kind of eventuality? In the interim, I think these are very spot on, but the question is where do we end up if this has to be something that is more interoperable, and you can't have one company doing one thing and another company doing another? Sure.
So I probably have a little bit of a different lens on how I see that, only because I think a lot of that interoperability stuff is governed by regulatory standards, but the standards themselves are open. So I know a few years ago, I was actually really surprised. The National Highway Transportation Safety Administration came out with a vehicle-to-vehicle like communications protocol, which would be used by stuff like this, and they actually shut it down. I was never able to figure out if it was a funding thing or not, but I think most of those challenges in terms of what a network would look like on the roads logistically, those can be handled through the same kind of regulations that we have now for how do cars operate on the road. I'm less worried about the solutions for those being from open source companies. I really think that car companies kind of like with the EPA today, apart from all the cheating that goes on, I think car companies will just figure out what the rules are and then kind of come up with their own suite to fall under the regulations legally. So I don't worry too much about that. I worry much more about companies like Uber saying, well, we're going to license out our platform. And then I'm like, well, okay, but what's the value prop of your platform? You're not as good at data as Google, and you're not as good at manufacturing as Tesla. Like, apart from having market share as a ride sharing company, like, why would I license your technology?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a follow-up, if you think about where that value is for the market and for the consumer, right? And one of the things that popped out in your presentation is like you kind of relied on this, like GM is good at making cars, right? And Google's good at understanding kind of data and technology, and Tesla's good at trying to be very narrow and very specific in the form factor that it has, and Uber's very good at, right? Like the players, generally speaking, bring different strengths to that value chain, and some are more marketable than others, right? As like I personally am really worried about auto manufacturers becoming the equivalent of an OEM, kind of like part supplier to the technology vendors. And I think you're right to realize, like, I don't know where Google and players like that land, because like they're kind of stuck in the mushy middle where they don't have a very good, they're not going to be directly connected to consumers, but they also don't manufacture. And, it seems to me, I almost feel like the Uber model of like, hey, if this all shakes out and there's a standards, then we're the customer interface that's really important and have that expertise. I mean, for example, like Google, like this is going to require a lot of customer service, right? It's going to think, if you think about like the capabilities required to deliver on these things, as well as the business models required to make money off of them, it's interesting to think through that, right?
Yeah, in my personal opinion, is I struggle to see GM or Ford becoming, hey, we only make chassis. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. And if it does happen, it's going to be in 50 years. I think they are still going to they're still going to be large volume automakers in every conceivable vehicle market. And then they have a side business that kind of develops these chassis. Because one of the real upshots of electric vehicles is they're much easier to make than internal combustion engines. And there's a lot of theories as to that's why Tesla started with electric vehicles as opposed to gas vehicles. And I think you could actually build a chassis at scale with, an EV motor at one end or both ends for all-wheel drive, and a battery pack in the middle that's made by Panasonic. You could actually, I think, make the chassis at scale much, much, much more easily than you could if you're going to make vehicles. And I think you could actually do that as more or less a side business. Like, I think GM or Ford could say, we have a passenger vehicle department, we've got a truck department, and then we've got like a chassis department, and they make an EV side. Where I think it's a little bit more unlikely for me personally is for GM to be like, okay, we're going to build the taxi soup to nuts, and we're going to have an app, and you're going to use, GM Taxi to get around. Like, I don't see that happening, but they are going to have to decide at some point, probably pretty soon, if that's the business they want to be in. I mean, whether or not I think it's a good idea, they are going to have to make these decisions, and they're going to have to do them, I think, a lot sooner than they want to.
Great, thanks. We did have one hand up, another one. So Sarthik, go ahead, and just real quick, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We will have to jump here in just a minute as well, but thank you, Chris and Sarthik. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is great, Chris. I do have a couple of questions that I might reach out to you offline around the modularized chassis. But real quick, in your conversations, did you ever talk about how consumers will respond to autonomous vehicles and what that might look like, 5-10 years down the line?
So I did, and I'm obviously a big car guy, and I honestly struggle to divorce myself from the conversation because people like me are not going to buy or are going to buy an autonomous vehicle with a lot of regret. Like I am probably still going to be the guy who has an old gas guzzling car in the garage. I think for people that consumers that live in big, dense cities with horrible commutes, I think those consumers are going to take to autonomous vehicles pretty easily, either by buying one directly or by going through a ride-sharing Robotaxi model. Once you get out of those cities, though, I think the demand for that drops off really, really quickly. Certainly more quickly than people who, like me, who have basically only ever lived in big cities realizes. Like if you're in rural Ohio or rural Kansas, like you're probably not going to have a sufficient Robotaxi network to get you around. And you're probably not going to want a purely autonomous vehicle either, just because your transportation needs are so different to, driving 15 miles in 45 minutes in Boston to sit in traffic. So I think that the consumer market is actually going to be really difficult to segment, even if you're just like looking within the autonomous vehicle market, versus the Robotaxi market. So I think it's incredibly difficult to answer that without kind of picking a segment and saying, well, what do consumers in this segment look like? Like me personally, like I'm the nightmare for autonomous vehicles. Like I don't want one. I would probably hail one like I hail an Uber, but like I like driving. I want to be able to take stuff apart. Like the product isn't for me. Fortunately, I think for the companies, like I am absolutely not their target market. And their target market really is people today who use Uber a lot and maybe have a Tesla in the garage or want a Tesla. So people who can take a Robotaxi when they want, but if they are going on a longer drive, then they could just use an actual autonomous vehicle to get there.
Great.
Gotcha. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, for your presentation today. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you for your questions, and we'll see y'all soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.